Hello and welcome to this bite-sized webinar series. My name is Kerry Hammick and I'm a consultant with the Compliance People. Today we'll be talking through waste transfer notes in Scotland. So today we will be covering what waste transfer notes are and why we need them, the information required on a waste transfer note, how to correctly complete a waste transfer note, and what annual waste transfer notes are and how they need to be completed. So let's start with the basics. Waste transfer notes are required for all transfers, and by transfers I mean movements, of non-hazardous waste to another party or site. You may also hear them be called waste information notes, waste notes, or maybe waste paperwork. In my experience, when people talk about a waste ticket, this isn't usually the same thing, as it doesn't have all of the required information on it. It's usually just a ticket to say that the waste has been taken, sort of like a delivery note. Section 34 of the Environmental Protection Act 1990 sets out a statutory duty of care for the importing, producing, keeping, treating or disposing of waste, and this applies to all parties in the waste chain. The Waste Scotland Regulations 2012 amended Section 34 to implement a number of actions in the Scottish Government's Zero Waste Plan. Under these amendments, holders of waste, including waste producers, have a duty to take reasonable steps to increase the quantity and quality of recyclable materials. The Environmental Protection Duty of Care Scotland Regulations 2014 require that a transfer note is signed by the transferor and the transferee of waste, and we'll go on to these definitions later on in the webinar. It also specifies which information should be included and requires copies to be kept for 2 years minimum. This enables the use of waste transfer notes to be used in electronic form also. Waste transfer notes also allow the regulator to understand what wastes are being generated and how they are being disposed of and recovered. The regulator in Scotland is the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, otherwise known as SIPA. Waste transfer notes also provide a clear paper trail from when the waste was produced to when it's disposed of, so cradle to grave. They're also a legal requirement and must contain all of the required information. It isn't a legal requirement to have all of the information completed on an actual waste transfer note, so long as the information is documented somewhere, but it's often the simplest way to do it, and if you use a waste transfer template you can make sure that everything that's legally required is on there. And this can be in a paper or electronic format, and we'll go through the required information in the next slides. You only need to have waste transfer notes in place where waste is being transferred to another party or site. If you're transferring waste within the same company on the same site, then you won't need one. So what is non-hazardous waste? Waste is considered to be non-hazardous when it doesn't cause harm directly to people or the environment, for example, paper, wood, or plastic. Essentially, it means that the waste does not contain hazardous properties. That's not to say it can't be damaging if stored or treated in the wrong manner. For example, if food waste was left to leach, it would attract flies and cause problems. However, the food waste itself is not inherently hazardous. So let's go through the requirements for waste transfer notes. The law is very specific about what transfer notes must contain, and it's important that nothing is missed. Also, auditors really love this stuff, so it's really important that we get it right. We need a description of the waste, any processes the waste have been through, how the waste is contained or packaged, what the quantity of the waste is, so the weight of it, the place and date of the transfer, so where the waste was collected and the date it was collected. We need details of the permit, license or exemption of the person receiving the waste, if possible. We also need the license or registration number of the person handing over the waste if they have a waste management license or are a registered carrier of controlled waste. We also need the appropriate European Waste Catalogue code, and we'll go on to what this means a bit later on. Also, the standard industry code, so the SIC code for your business. I appreciate this is quite a long list, so we'll go over these in more detail later on. So now we're going to have a look at a waste transfer note template. So the one that you can see here is a template set out by SIPA. You'll see many different versions of this, and as long as all the required information is on there, that's okay. It's just making sure that you've got all the detail. So generally, transfer notes are in 4 parts, parts A to D. And as I said, you can use different formats as long as all the information's on there. You need to correctly classify the waste, so you can do this by using Technical Guidance WM3, and I'll explain a bit more later on about what this is and how you can use it. And as said before, waste transfer notes need to be retained for a minimum of 2 years. So let's start by looking at section A, which is about identifying the waste. So essentially it's about explaining what the waste is and clearly identifying it. We want to know exactly what it is, how much of it is contained, how it's contained, and how much there is. So we need to describe the waste. Is it paper, card, wood, metal, etc.? We want to know how the waste is contained. Is it in a skip? Is it in sacks? Is it loose? And how much waste is there? We also need to record on the transfer note in this section the European Waste Catalogue Code, and you'll also sometimes hear this called the List of Waste Code. You can find common codes on the websites below. It can be quite difficult sometimes to categorise waste, and it's beyond the scope of this webinar to go through in detail how you do this. But if you use the links below, then they have some codes that will be for things you use in your business every day, like paper, plastics, that kind of thing. It's better, however, to use the full list in WM3, the Technical Guidance, to make sure that you're identifying the waste correctly. So this is what WM3 looks like. It's the Technical Guidance for waste classification, and it's a comprehensive reference manual for anyone that's involved in producing and managing waste, and it's also used by waste regulators. Appendix A includes the waste classification codes, also referred to as the LOW codes, list of waste codes, or EWC codes, so European Waste Catalogue codes. And this is for hazardous and non-hazardous wastes, although for the purposes of today, we're just looking at non-hazardous waste for transfer notes. This document does not provide guidance on the packaging and labelling of waste for transport. Just a word of warning, it's a very long document, it's 185 pages long, but the key bit that you need to know about for the purposes of waste transfer notes is Appendix A, as this is where the waste codes are. It can be quite complicated to use, as there's a particular way you should read it, and an order in which the chapters need to be checked in Appendix A. However, this is beyond the scope of the training today. The important thing is that you just need to know where the most common waste codes are that relate to your business. So when we talk about identifying waste codes, what do we actually mean? Waste codes are 6-digit codes. They list waste according to the industrial process or business activity that produced the waste. So here we want to know exactly what the waste is and where it's come from. The list of wastes contains 20 chapters that relate either to a process that generated the waste or to the specific waste types. The chapters are given a 2-digit number, so for example 20, which is the municipal chapter, and it's really important that you use the right code. An asterisk means that the waste is hazardous, so we don't need these when dealing with non-hazardous waste. So as you can see here, these are the 2-digit numbers of the chapters. So for example, we have 03, which is waste from wood processing and the production of panels and furniture, pulp, paper and cardboard. As mentioned, chapter 20, which is municipal waste. So this is one of the more common chapters that's used because it's for household waste and similar commercial, industrial and institutional wastes, including separately collected fractions. So this will be relevant for business. Also chapter 15, which is relevant as this is waste packaging, absorbents, wiping cloths, filter materials and protective clothing not otherwise specified. So most of your packaging waste will be coded using chapter 15. Section B of the waste transfer note is about where the waste transfer took place and when. So in this section, you need to record the name and address of the transferor. So this is the current holder of the waste, which is usually the waste producer. So this is when you're giving your waste to somebody else. We need to have the name and address of the business who arranged the transfer, if this is applicable, and also the date of the waste transfer, so when it took place. We'll move on to section C now, and this is about the waste holder, so we need to record their details in this section. We need the name, address, email address and telephone number of the transferor. We need to identify if the holder is the waste producer or carrier, if they hold an environmental permit or waste management license, is it a local authority, a professional waste collector, a transporter, and we also need the relevant registration numbers if they hold any of the authorisations just mentioned. We also need to record the standard industry code for the business of the waste holder, so that's the SIC code. And finally, we need to have the signature. It's very important that this is signed. So in this slide, we're going to talk a bit more about what SIC codes actually are. They're referred to a lot when talking about waste transfer notes. So SIC, SIC, stands for Standard Industry Classification. It's a 4-digit code, which is basically a system of classifying industries, and it's used for financial and business administration. So an example of a SIC code is 1712 for a site that manufactures paperboard. You might also see it written as 17.12.2, which is the old version, and it doesn't matter which way around it is, both are fine. You need to make sure that on every waste transfer note, the SIC code is correct. This is quite a common mistake that we see on waste transfer notes. You can check the SIC code for your company on Companies House using the link in the slide. Also, if you search for your company on Companies House, you can easily see the SIC code when it comes up. Section D of the waste transfer note is all about the waste receiver. The waste receiver can also sometimes be known as the transferee. In section D, you need to record the name, address, email address and telephone number of the transferee. You need to identify if the transferee is a registered waste carrier, if they hold a permit, license, are a local authority, a professional waste collector or transporter, and any of the relevant registration numbers for those authorisations. In this section, also need to have a signature from the transferee. The person collecting the waste must have a carrier's registration, and you can check this on the SIPA website using their public register. So to recap, these are the key requirements on a waste transfer note. It's easier if this format is used because it covers everything you need. It's a bit more difficult if it's on a different form. You need to be a bit more vigilant and check that everything's on it. And this template is available on the SIPA website. So in section A, we need to make sure that we've got the waste producer company name and address, and this can be the head office of the company. We need to make sure that the waste carrier details, permit details, and whether they're a professional collector and transporter of waste or a local authority are recorded, and any relevant numbers and registration details. We need to have in section C, the waste producer holder name, so that's the site name, address, and this can be the same as in section B unless the site location is different. We need to make sure that we've got the waste description and the EWC codes, and also the quantity and container type that the waste is in. We need to make sure we've got the waste receiver details and signature, the waste producer and holder signature, and also the SIC code. You might also hear people talk about annual waste transfer notes or season tickets, and these are for movements of non-hazardous waste of the same types and quantities using the same contractors to and from the same sites. So season tickets or annual waste transfer notes are single waste transfer notes that cover a series of non-hazardous waste transfers. They can last up to 1 year and are used for regular transfers of the same type of non-hazardous waste with the same waste carrier. If you have several sites serviced by the same carrier with the same types of waste collected from you, these can be listed in a schedule to the season ticket. You should also keep a record of the collection times and the quantity of waste that's being collected. A good way to do this is to get a delivery ticket from the carrier for each load collected, stating when the collection took place, what the waste was, and how much was collected. and this is really useful for your records and demonstrating that you fulfilled your duty of care. As with any other waste transfer note, these need to be kept for a minimum of 2 years, and it needs to be really clear on the single waste transfer note for the year which dates the note runs between. In summary then, as a waste producer, your obligations apply right up to the point of disposal. You have a duty of care to make sure that your waste is disposed of correctly, and this is a legal obligation. You must use a registered waste carrier to collect waste from you. You must also check that your waste is being taken to a permitted site by them, and this again relates to your waste duty of care and making sure you comply with your legal obligations. You can check waste carriers and permitted sites on the SIPA website. You need to keep proof of the above and also a waste transfer note which has the waste description, the correct EWC codes recorded, the producer and carrier details, the producer's SIC code, and 2 signatures which is signed correctly and dated. You need to keep copies of waste transfer notes for a minimum of 2 years, and this is both for annual waste transfer notes and for transfer notes that record individual transfers. Thank you very much for watching this webinar. I hope you found it useful. The Compliance People is the UK's leading provider of environment and health and safety compliance management services, and we've got lots more resources and guidance available, and you can find these if you head over to our website, thecompliancepeople.co.uk. Thank you again for listening.